Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to this global workshop organized by the French Club of Regulators, hosted by the Governance and Regulation Chair at the University Paris-Dauphine and the OECD Network of Economic Regulators. The mission of regulators is to enhance the performance of operators in regulated industries and to make sure that public policy objectives are articulated with economic efficiency imperatives. But how can we assess the performance of regulatory agencies? In this conference, we will focus on the criteria, on the methods and the processes relied upon or experimented in various national contexts to assess the performance of regulators. The first roundtable about the institutional organization of these performance assessments will be chaired by Dominique Jam. Dominique is the general manager of the French energy regulator, the Clerc, and president of the Club des Régulateurs as well. The second roundtable about the methodological aspect of this assessment will be facilitated by Anne-Yves Billon, who is Director for Economy, Market and Digital at the French Telecommunication Authority, and who is also the chair of the Network of Economic Regulators. And the conclusion will be managed by Anna Pietikainen from the OECD. The first speaker this morning of this first roundtable is Anna Vadasz Nilsson, who is Vice President of the Council of European Energy Regulators, and she will present the institutional organization of such a performance assessment of regulators in a European perspective, and is also Director of the Swedish Energy Market Inspectorate. She will be directly followed by Manuel Cabugueira, coordinator of the technical unit for legislative impact assessment within the Portuguese government. Anna Vadasz Nilsson, the floor is yours.
So thanks a lot again for this opportunity to share some thoughts about CER's work related to assessing retail markets. CER is the voice of Europe's energy regulators. It's a voluntary organization, and we have 36 members and observers. The members are basically the EU and EEA countries, including the UK. And the observers are the EU energy contracting parties. Through CER, we as regulators, we promote well-functioning and competitive EU markets that put consumer in the center. And I think it can be good to know that in the EU, we have more or less integrated and harmonized wholesale energy markets. But the retail markets, they still remain very national. And they are not at the same phase. Some of them are quite competitive. Others are more sort of starting to open up for competition. But of course, we have some harmonized rules and on the retail side, and we will get even more now when we have this new EU legislation coming into force, the clean energy package. That will more or less harmonize quite a lot of areas in the retail markets. But I still think that retail energy markets will be national for many years to come, even though we have a lot of harmonization. As I said, the retail markets, they differ throughout the union. Some are quite well functioning, others are just starting to open up for competition. But what we have seen is that there is quite a good correlation between the wholesale and retail markets throughout, if you look at the aggregated numbers in the EU. But we had for many years, now we see a correlation, but for many years we actually had the opposite. Retail, wholesale markets, the prices went down, while retail markets actually went up. That's an indication that something isn't working, and that's the reason why we started to work on assessing this. So what is the well-functioning market according to us? Well, in 2015, we decided on a high-level strategic paper on how to define this, how to define a well-functioning market, but also how to get there by 2025. And it seemed a long sort of time span in 2015, but it's not so long now, so we are halfway now, or even further. But back in 2015, we decided on some high-level principles, but also 8 key properties that, according to us, I sort of is significant of a well-functioning market. In 2017, we developed a handbook on how to measure the properties and also, of course, the high-level principles. And we developed 25 matrices. We also started to train our members on how to evaluate the national markets according to those matrices. In 2018, we developed a handbook also on how to collect and assess your own national data, and how to make gap analysis on sort of where sort of an ideal outcome of a metric and where you are in reality. And also, of course, to be able to help the NRAs to do sort of policy recommendations in order to what to sort of fix in your own national retail markets. And then we have compiled through 2 status reports where actually we are in real life with this sort of iterative work evaluating national retail markets. So here you see the 2 high-level principles. It's competition and innovation and consumer involvement, quite high level, but still something features that are sort of significant for well-functioning markets. And you see the 8 key properties. It's low concentration, low market barrier, entry barriers, the relationship between wholesale and retail, as I said. Now we see better correlation, but for many years we had this sort of the prices did not correlate. And also, of course, what we have seen in many retail markets in the EU is that even if we have price correlation, the gap actually widens when wholesale prices goes down, the retail prices is slower. That's what we call prices go up like rockets and down like feathers. So this is also something, of course, to pay attention to. The range of offers is something else that is, of course, a key property. Awareness and trust is another one. Of course, how if you have empowerment tools available for customers that actually lower search costs for customers in order for them to be active. Sufficient consumer engagement, and of course also very important appropriate protection. That's something that we also see as part of a well-functioning retail markets. And this then to be able to measure the properties and the principles, we developed 25 matrices. Here you see the properties and a lot of matrices, and of course some of them are quite obvious, like the Herfindahl index and switching rates. This is matrices that many national regulators have access to. But of course, some others that we developed are not that easy to measure. We have, for example, the availability of services for customers to engage in demand response and self-generation. This is sort of upcoming markets that are maybe not as developed yet. And therefore, of course, hard to get hold of data maybe, and even it might be non-existing in some member states. Here we see also awareness and trust, percentage of customers that understand how the market works, actually, that the DSO, that's monopoly, and the supplier is something that takes place in competition. So this is also an area where we had difficulties collecting data nationally. it's very important to stress that this is not a benchmark. When we do this sort of assessment, it's not a benchmark exercise. We do benchmarks also in CR together with our EU agency, ACER, the Agency for Cooperation Between Energy Regulators. And there we do proper benchmark. We look at different metrics and we compare countries. But this exercise with a self-assessment, it is a self-assessment. It's the national regulators that determines the context and the methodology, and therefore, if an NRA has done data collection and gap analysis, this is not comparable with other countries. And also, of course, as I said before, some countries might not have access to all the 25 metrics, which also makes it hard to compare. But we try to, of course, I mean, the whole idea with this roadmap is to encourage national development. And the ultimate goal is, of course, that all NRAs can assess if they have well-functioning market. And of course, the goal is to have that. But also, of course, a goal in itself is to be able to look at yourself, your own market, and see if it's effective enough. And the ideal is, of course, to make this gap analysis for all the 25 metrics. Because, I mean, if you are going to assess a market, it's quite important that you do it 360 degrees. Just market concentration, for example, don't give you the full answer if your market is well functioning or not. You can have quite high concentration levels, but or ratios, but have other features in your national market that actually make the market more competitive than if you just look at the concentration ratio. So this is something to pay attention to. I mean, the idea is also, as I said, to try to show progress. So we did 2 status reports to share the experience between ourselves. But of course, this is not easy. And as I said, some of the metrics might be non-existing, and it might be hard to get access to data. So what we have seen is, of course, throughout those years when we have done those self-assessment nationally, is that the completion level and speed of these assessments are different between the different NRAs. And also an obstacle, because our idea is that you collect data, you do the self-assessment, you make a gap analysis between sort of an ideal sort of metric or outcome of a metric and where you are, and then you do policy recommendations. But the problem is that some NRAs are not legally, they don't have the possibility to legally set national targets for individual metrics. There are maybe 3-4 of them in our CR organization, and some also have problems that the responsibility for different metrics and to follow different areas of the market is split between different public bodies. And I'm not sure if that is true for all member states in the EU, but some actually have problems. The public bodies have problems talking to each other. This is, of course, something that we need to overcome, but still this has been an obstacle. And so far, we have also, as I said, focused on all the metrics. And it's for some NRAs that's been all or nothing. And we think that has been a problem for us. And the discussions that we've had, we often end up in discussing the problems getting data and the problems with different metrics. And we have maybe a bit drifted away from the focus on the ultimate goal, and that's the exercise itself to assess our own national markets and to be able to evaluate if we have well-functioning retail markets. And we want to move away from this sort of focus on the individual metrics and try to do as good as we can and try to show that we as regulators, we are we take an interest not only in regulating the monopoly area and trying to monitor the existing rules in place, be it also on the supply side, but we also take an interest in the development of well-functioning markets. So what we have discussed now, and we have a new focus for this year, and we think that if we are not able to collect all the 25 metrics, maybe we can group the metrics into groups. So we have suggested as an organization, SEER, to have 3 groups with 3 to 7 metrics in each group. But we also are very open if one Andrey want to suggest another group, that's okay, because this is not a benchmark exercise. It's an exercise where the national regulator itself try to evaluate how well functioning, how effective is my national market. So this is our way forward. And of course, we will also still try to do this status report based on the data, which is not a benchmark. It's more showing the progress in each member state. And here is at least what we decided last year, the groups. So one group for market concentration, consumer activity and awareness. And here we have different matrices. Another on demand response. I think it's a growing area. So even though it might be quite juvenile markets, but this is something that is coming very strongly. So we still need to try to look at that. Time of use meters is, of course, not only connected to demand response, but of course, a prerequisite, you need to have a meter that can actually make it possible to respond to very sort of short time frames. Concentration and price formation is also it's key. It should have been maybe the first one here, but of course, this is very important. Market concentration and the correlation, and also the markup between how wide the gap is between the wholesale and retail price. So that was all I was going to say about our self-assessment. It's a piece in sort of the strive to move towards more well-functioning market. Hopefully we can get more national regulators on board when we are moving away from you need to evaluate all the metrics, otherwise you can't do it. So hopefully this sort of grouping will be a good way forward for us. And I'm looking forward to see the report for next year when we do the status report. Thank you.
So that is one of the relations that we have with regulators in Portugal. A second, more interesting relation is the fact that in all workshops that we have, open workshops that we have on impact assessment in Portugal, there is always a lot of interest by the regulators to participate. I can tell you that usually we have more than 30% of the participators coming from regulators. Not only that, but we also see a lot of participation from the regulator firms. So we have the businesses that are regulated coming into the workshops, and they are interested in knowing how they can call for a more evidence-based regulation and a more supportive based regulation. So it is interesting to see that during the 4 years, whenever we have any kind of workshop on any topic related to impact assessment, there is always a very important interest coming from the regulated sector in Portugal. In what regards the development of the methodology, as I said, we have obviously focusing more on the economic impact assessment, but we have also developed during the 4 years tools to analyze impact on competition, to analyze impact on innovation. We have on gender, on the differentiation, on the different areas of social impact. So we have a toolbox that is full of instruments that are used on a day-to-day basis, but might be interesting for the regulators to use, and that is what we have been sharing them. We also have more technical, practical instruments regarding where we try to use big data analysis, artificial intelligence methods to help and to make the overall analysis quicker, less expensive, and more efficient. And we have also the possibility of sharing with the regulators all those instruments. And I like to believe that whenever we go to a workshop, an internal workshop, somehow we are contributing to the overall toolbox that the regulator has to do their own assessments. I'm not going to take too much more time. Just a last message, and I'll obviously look forward for the continue of the discussion. Regulation is definitely a means or an instrument to help the markets to fail better. And I truly believe that that is not only the goal of the independent regulators, but the goal of anyone that works in public intervention. And I also believe that evidence-based regulation and the use of impact assessment tools is an important an important instrument that we can use to achieve that goal. And that is, for me, one of my main motivations for doing what I do and for having the contact that I have with the different independent regulators in Portugal. And I will finish here and looking forward for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for this very, very comprehensive view on the impact assessment for regulator. So I will now welcome our next speaker, Andrey Tsyganov. Andrey holds a doctorate in economics. He has extensive experience in industry and public administration. He joined in 1990 the Russian Federal Competition Authority. Now he is the deputy head of the Russian Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, FAS. He also held governmental positions related to anti-monopoly policy and the support of entrepreneurships. He actively participates to the Federal Anti-Monopoly Services cooperation with international organizations and foreign competition authorities in the area of anti-monopoly policy. So he will provide us with a presentation on the realization of performance assessment of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service. Please, Andrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Do you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be with you today and share our Russian experience in regulatory impact analysis and performance analysis of our activity. And I'd like to start with a few words about general system of RIA in Russian Federation. First projects in this area had been launched in our country in late 90s, and from 2010 the regulatory impact analysis is the obligation of any governmental authority on the federal, regional, and local levels when any authority wants to introduce any legal changes or new legal acts. The federal authority who is responsible for the methodology of this in this area is the Ministry of Economic Development, and the obligation of us as well as any other authority is the placement of our draft legal acts on a special web portal of regulatory acts and draft regulatory acts for comments. And it means that all draft legal acts, before they are approved and enacted, are debated by all interested parties: governmental authorities, NGOs, academia, other stakeholders, and nowadays it's impossible to introduce any legal changes without providing the State Duma and the government of the Russian Federation with the results of this examination of draft legal acts. I should mention that the same mechanisms are implemented not only on the national level, but now within 5 countries of the Euro-Asian Economic Union. That's Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. And the Treaty of the Union provides tools for improvement of legislation on the supranational level, and as well as on the national level, all stakeholders are involved in this process. Speaking about the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service Agency, I should mention that there is both internal and external performance assessment, and I'd like to stress the public component and public element of this process. First of all, the Russian Account Chamber and the Russian Ministry of Finance annually conduct the analysis of the observance of the budget and financial discipline of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service. It's very important for us, of course, but the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service assessment is also conducted by the State Duma and by the Council of the Federation of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation on a regular basis. For instance, during the so-called government hours, it's regular reports of the heads of executive authorities before the chambers of our parliaments, when the authorities answer a lot of very difficult and serious questions from the members of the parliament. The obligation of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service in accordance with the law on protection of competition is preparation and presentation of the annual report on the state of competition in Russian Federation for the Russian government. We produce this annual report together with NGOs, with other governmental authorities, and this report contains not only the general provisions of how competition has been developing during last years or some years. It contains assessment of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service performance and the state, as well as the state of competition in Russia, including information about achieved results in development of competition, implementation of some legal and practical measures of development of competition, and assessment of the efficiency of these measures by the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service and by external parties. That's very important. Of course, you know that the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service is a multifunctional authority, and it means that we report not only about the competition development and about our activity in this area, but about all our functions, including, for instance, public procurement regulation or tariff regulations, for example. And this report is discussed during the meetings of the government of the Russian Federation by its members. And of course, on the basis of this discussion, the Russian government makes some conclusions and certain guidelines to the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service and other governmental authorities on the basis of the outcomes of our annual report of competition. It's important that activity of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service of the Russian Federation is also assessed by the Public Council under the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, whose purpose is to exercise public control over performance of the FAS, including considerations of drafts of most important and socially significant legal and other normative acts that being developed, participation in the monitoring of the quality of public services that FAS provides to the citizens of the Russian Federation, and and as well as anti-corruption and HR management activities of the inside the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, and consideration of the plans of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service for the 1 year or 3 years periods of times. And for the most objective and comprehensive evaluation of activity of authority, our public council includes knowledgeable Russian experts in the field of competition, public service, and other areas of regulation, representatives of the scientific, of academia and business community and civil society as well. And moreover, since 2016, the FAS performance assessment is organized by key performance indicators. And we, the Central Office of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, annually evaluates the activity of 84 regional departments of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service according with our internal system of key performance indicators as well, and complies the rating of the performance of our regional offices. It's very important and very stimulating tool of internal management and administration of the staff of Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, of 34 methods of key performance indicator calculation in our activity. It's a very complicated system, and only special team of specialists in our HR department know this system in general. It's also worth noting that the Russian competition law itself provides a unique possibility for the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service to assess the other governmental authorities' performance in the area of compliance with anti-monopoly legislation. The specific and unique feature of Russian competition law is that it covers not only the anti-competitive actions of undertakings, but anti-competitive actions of public authorities as well. And every year, the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service and our regional offices conducts antitrust investigations against authorities and their officials if they carry out measures and issue regulatory legal act that can negatively adversely affect the competition. For instance,
sorry, Andrey, Dominique, time is running. Maybe
yes,
you could go to your concluding remarks.
Just a few words. Thank you, Dominique.
Thanks.
For instance, last year in 1990, the anti-monopoly authorities have nearly 700 cases of competition law by authorities, and administrative liability in the form of a fine or disqualification for up to 3 years can result from violation of these standards by officials. I should mention that in accordance with the decree of the President of the Russian Federation in 2017, as sort of anti-monopoly compliance for authorities on the federal and regional level have been introduced, and it's very important as well. And the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service provide technical assistance and methodological assistance to all other authorities in preparation of the document to implement this anti-monopoly compliance. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you very much, Andrey, for this view on the Russian activities regarding competition policy and impact assessment. So now I will give the floor to our last, not speaker, but speakers. We have Charles Nancarrow and Rich Sullivan-Jones, who both work at the NAO in the UK, which is National Audit Office, which is an independent oversight body for public expenditure and for public expenditure. So Charles is head of financial analysis. He heads up the team examining delivery of public policy in the areas of consumer protection, regulation, and international trade. He has extensive experience working on the public sector and international agencies. Rich is an audit manager and specializes in independent external scrutiny and value for money of public bodies on matters of regulation, consumers, and competition. They will give us an example of the UK experience for regulatory performance and evaluation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, so my name is Charles Nancarrow, and thank you for the invite to come and talk today. We will, between Rich and I, we will cover the work that we've been doing over the last few years around regulatory performance measurement. I'll set out the context in which we work and why we've been doing this work, and then Rich is going to go through more details about what that work shows and the specifics around regulatory performance measurement. So just, it's quite important to understand our role. We are independent, but we work for the UK Parliament. So we are the organisation that holds the regulators to account for their performance. We are independent of government, but we have a very important role to play in terms of holding the regulators to account. It's regulatory performance measurement and accountability, as you're all aware, is a very difficult subject, and we've been working over a number of years to try and improve the quality of regulatory performance measurement, the sort of information and the quality of information that Parliament and the public can use to hold the regulators to account. Rich will talk a little bit more about the specifics of this, but back in 2016, we produced a guide with a lot of the UK regulators to talk about what good performance measurement looks like, you know, what sort of measures they should be using, what sort of information, how they should be reporting, what sort of governance structures they should be using to show that they are both independent and providing good outcomes. Now, the reason why we feel this is so important is because the independent accountability of regulators is both, as we see it, it's both to the public and to Parliament. Now, if we take those in turn, the public has expectations of the regulator. So, for example, the energy regulator, it wants to know that when the public are buying energy, it's at the best possible deal, that actually the energy regulator is operating in an environment where it is optimizing protection of the environment, but it's also securing security of supply. So the public want to know that the energy system in the UK works well, but actually a lot of the responsibilities that the regulator has will come into conflict. It can't at the same time make energy really cheap and protect the environment and secure supply. So there's the trade-off between those different objectives. And so we feel that it's very important that those are clearly reported and measured against, so that the public can understand that actually the regulator has limitations in what it can do and has trade-offs to make in the way it does it. And furthermore, for parliamentary accountability, the way the UK regulators are structured is they are independent in law, and they are given objectives in law by the departments, but there are a lot of policy issues which the department will look after. So this things like vulnerable consumers, how are they treated? And so we feel it's important for parliamentary accountability that there's absolute clarity between what the department what the policy department is doing and what the independent regulator is doing. So that's why we've done this work. It's very important to have clarity around these issues and to provide good quality performance information and monitoring. So that's the context in which we've done this work, and Rich is going to talk a bit more about the findings.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Charles. So when it comes to the way that we think about the performance assessment in this area, we look for three key features to be present. The first of which Charles has already talked about, which is clarity on what the regulator is responsible for in the first place. What is its remit? What is it trying to achieve? In a very broad sense, and how does that fit in with what government is trying to achieve and the links between them? Charles talked about that a bit already. The second is clarity on what regulators are actually trying to achieve in detail. We talk about impact assessments in that context. And then the third is then when you know what you're responsible for, what it is you're trying to achieve, how well are you actually doing? What's your progress in achieving what it is you're setting out to try and achieve? So, like I say, we talked about the first one already. On the second, what are regulators trying to achieve? So, regulators exist ultimately to correct market failures, as Manuel kind of indicated earlier, as does most public policy intervention. So firstly, regulators need to understand what the problem is and how that's changing, but also where they want to get to. So not just a very broad sense of you should be trying to protect consumers, ensuring value for money, having high quality services, but to actually say what specifically would good look like in this market, and what can the regulator do to get there. In the UK, regulators tend to have quite a good understanding of what the issues are. It's not perfect by any means, but they have a lot of good data and insight, particularly the big economic regulators. But when it comes to clarity on where they want to get to and what they want to achieve, that tends to be more lacking. Impact assessments in the UK, very similar, I think, to Portugal. They're required for big changes that go through the UK Parliament, but they're not required if there's no Act of Parliament or statutory instrument. And so regulators, they produce impact assessments or some sort of cost-benefit analysis for the most part for their larger interventions, but there's no requirement for those to be public or for them to be done in a kind of formal way. So the accountability process is unclear there. And for the overall picture, rather than not just on individual interventions, but what the regulators are doing in the round, they tend to articulate things in quite vague, high-level ways. They'll say we want high-quality services for consumers, we want prices to be lower than they would otherwise be. But they don't specify what kind of level of reductions in prices and how they're going to measure that, how they're going to assess the impact that they're having. We don't disagree with what Anne was saying earlier about the importance of how well a market is performing. Absolutely, that's really important. If a market is going excellently, the role of the regulator may not be that important. In the UK and in most places, markets don't tend to be working that fantastically. So then there's a question of how big a difference is the regulator making, and that's where we think more clarity is needed on what they're trying to achieve in the first place. And then the final step is then how do you actually measure and crucially report the performance as a regulator? It's a difficult thing to do. Regulators rely a lot on influence and on they're quite distant from the actual delivery of the services, from that transactional relationship between the consumer and the provider, and also the regulatory outcomes are quite often, particularly in economic regulation, quite long-term in nature. It can be 5, 10, 15 years before we really know whether approaches are working well or not. So we've been pushing quite hard to encourage regulators to have a much broader suite of indicators and a deeper understanding of their impact on those different indicators. So yes, absolutely, they should know what's going on in the market, but also to be deepening their understanding of what impact they're having on those outcomes, and what are the crucial things that they're doing to affect those outcomes and improve them. And the big regulators in the UK, they're all kind of on that journey. Is a cliche way to say it, but they're certainly improving. What we found in our recent work is they are improving their use of these both external and internal metrics and indicators. They're publishing more than they ever have, but they still tend to be thinking about what's happening in the market on its own, and then separately, what are they doing on its own? And there's still not, in our view, enough of a link between the two. And to assess how well a regulator is performing, that link is absolutely crucial. And some are starting to have more evaluations. Post-implementation reviews and assessments following up on impact assessments are pretty thin in the UK and very rarely published. But some of the bigger regulators are starting to separately produce their own evaluations of some of their bigger interventions. which is helping. It's helping to improve things, but public reporting and parliamentary accountability isn't where we think it needs to be yet. Yeah, I think that's probably leave it there for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Rich and Charles. Really, always fascinating to hear from the UK, because we all know that the UK has been the precursor of independent regulation in Europe, I would say. So very interesting. So if we have a few minutes for questions and answers, Eric, okay. I have one question from the floor, which is addressed to Manuel, but I think other speakers may have an idea on that, which is, well, if you have to evaluate performance, you have to construct some counterfactuals, because what would have happened if the regulators have not been involved in that matter? And so for Mr. Cabugueira, how do you construct a counterfactual to assess the impact on innovation, for instance? Manuel?
Trying to how to construct counterfactuals. That's a good. It's a very interesting technical question, but I believe that you want a straightforward answer, and I don't have one. Well, let me say, well, that is definitely a challenge, and it is a challenge when you're facing economic evaluation. It is even a bigger challenge when you're facing innovation regulation. Let me say the following. Everybody is concentrating now. So we have, during the last year, we have evolved from saying that regulations should be fit for purpose. Then we said that it should be fit for future, and now we are saying that it should be resilient, which for me is very curious, because resilient in Latin means making everything stays the same, not evolving. But anyway, which is strange. But and we have been dealing with that. And having said that, when you are trying to construct a counterfactual in what comes to innovation, you have to do two things: truly bring on board stakeholders. So you must have someone that will help you to understand the market and view the market. If you want to go any further on that, you should also bring on board people that will help you to develop models of foresight, and not only the usual econometric models that we have. So models of constructing sceneries for the future, and to do this in a short period, that when you're pressed for intervention, the only way to do it is to actually, and as I said, to have someone from the market to help you. Two other comments. When we are constructing counterfactuals on specific issues like innovation, like the impact on SMEs, like the impact on competitiveness, there is a tendency to forget that you might find relevant information on other kinds of analysis. For instance, if you're looking on the impact on innovation, you might want to also look at the impact on competition, and you want to also look at impact on barriers to entrance. And that is to say that you should have an overall perspective on things. I do know that I tried my best to say a couple of ideas, not answering completely to your answer to your question, because it is really hard. Thank you for it.
Yeah, thanks, Manuel. Well, any other comment on the question of counterfactual, performance evaluation, and innovation? Anne?
Yes, sorry, trying to unmute myself. Maybe not on the counterfactual. It is a challenge. Sometimes also, I mean, I know all about these impact assessments. We do them at my own authority when we suggest new legislation in all kinds of level, also secondary, where we actually don't have to suggest, we just introduce new legislation. We have been given that from the parliament and the government. So, but we do it. But I was just going to pick up on something that Manuel said. I spent many years at the competition authority as well, 13 years actually. So, and that was something I touched upon in my own presentation. It's really, I mean, it's easy maybe to evaluate one tiny bit of the whole sort of context. You need to look at a context you can't just take out one thing. And I fully agree with what Manuel said. When you evaluate the impact of something, you need to look at it in a broader context. And that's the tricky part when you have matrices, when you have key performance indicators, and when you are trying to measure sort of the reality. That's the trickiest thing, I think. And that's something that we constantly need to remind ourselves of, that it's hard to sort of give the full answer by just answering impact on innovation or the counterfactual details or the zero alternative. So just adding more complexity to this and not answering the question. Sorry for that, but I just wanted to say that I fully agree on this. We need to be very agile. And also, I think some of the markets that we are trying to look upon, and also some of the context that some of us regulators are in, are very dynamic. Change is happening very, very fast in the energy market, for example. And that's also tricky then to predict the alternative or the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and very, very interesting. Any a word from the UK or Russia on this one? Yes, please.
Yes, shall I quickly go? I think it's a very good question. I just wanted to make a very small point really about, I think, having any kind of counterfactual in ex post evaluation can be difficult if you've not in advance set up what you're looking for, what you're expecting to see, what data you need to be collecting over that period. So that could be a harder thing to do ex post. But when it comes to things like impact assessments, or at the point of deciding what intervention you're going to make and how you're going to do it, a number of UK regulators have started using randomized control trials as a way to develop a predicted counterfactual, if you like, by testing in smaller groups different approaches to addressing a problem, and using that. So that doesn't, when you actually roll out these approaches, it doesn't necessarily mean that it goes the way you want it to go, and you don't have a robust counterfactual for that. But at least at the point of decision making on what you're going to do, you have better evidence on what works. Now this showing some very good impact for things like consumer behaviour. So the way in which information is presented to consumers to prompt engagement is very effective for that kind of thing. We've seen things from the energy regulator, from the financial services regulator in the UK. I don't know exactly how well that might work for things like innovation, but the principle of being able to test things in a limited way beforehand can help, provide evidence to develop counterfactuals.
Thanks very much, Rich. Andrey, one last word, because we have to give the floor to the next roundtable. 1 minute, Andrey.
Thank you, Dominic. I think your question is a key question in our performance, because every day we should be a wizard and we should predict the future, and we should know what could happen if. And it's a challenge for any authority, and for multifunctional authorities as well, to prove the theory of harm, to run a sort of dynamic analysis of competition and some other factors. For Russian Competition Authority, as a multifunctional regulator, it's not only a challenge, it's a fora, because the most important thing is to compare the alternative ways and kinds of governmental intervention. We can make something like fine-tuning of a public procurement system. That's our responsibility. We can adjust the tariff regulation in regulated industries, and it can affect not only the regulated industries itself, but consumer of these services and goods provided by regulated industries. We can use and prioritize the competition law enforcement in some areas, in some regions of our country. And like a sort of a experiment, we want to launch a system of ex post analysis of our previous decisions. Of course, not for all the cases, but for most important, for the cases that really change the situation in some industries, in some branches of Russian economy, and so on and so forth. It's a challenge. It's a very interesting future. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrey. Well, I would like, on behalf of all the participants, to thank very much all our speakers. Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting. And Eric, I give the floor to the next roundtable. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you, Dominique, for this right on time management of the first panel. And we switch directly to the second panel, which will be chaired by Annie Van-Billon. And I will ask also the other panelists to switch on their camera, that the participant could see them from the beginning. Maybe we will miss Nadia Horstmann from Germany, because she wrote us this morning that there was a major failure of the Vodafone grid in Germany this morning, and so she was expecting problems with her connection, but maybe she will be online. Anne, the floor is yours for the second roundtable, and the overall conference will be concluded then by Anna Pietikainen from the OECD.
Let us now switch to our second speaker, who is also from an energy regulatory agency, Madam Carmen Silvia Sanches, who is an energy regulation specialist from the Brazilian Electricity Regulatory Agency, who will present us the experience of these regulatory bodies, ANEL, when it comes to actions and results related to impact assessment. Carmen, the floor is yours for about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Listen to me? I listen? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for, well, the invitation. Good afternoon for you. Good morning to my friends here in Brazil, or my colleagues from ANEL, that I'm sure that I listened to our presentation. I'm here to bring some experience from ANEL, involve the actions and results related to impact assessment, and emphasize the regulatory cycle, the methodological issues, data and communication that you have used for evidence-based decision making. First, I'd like to say something about ANEL, the Brazilian Electricity Regulatory Agency. Our main mission is to provide favorable conditions for the electric power market, to develop with a balance between the agents and for the benefit of the society. This is important to highlight this mission because it explains some characteristics and how the regulatory impact assessment is conducted within the agency and also outside, and even some methodological choices you do for the assessments, because it's a really very complex environment with several stakeholders, different stakeholders, and then so different responsibilities. Then, since 2011, that ANEL have conducted the regulatory impact assessments, and since then you have completed 193 impact assessments, and also recently you have conducted assessing regulatory performance, and then we had only 4 until now. Then it is a novelty to close the whole regulatory cycle at ANEL. And the regulatory cycle begins with the regulatory agenda. This agenda is open for public participation to choose the issue through the usually informal public hearing. And this year you had the innovation. You changed the right of the agenda to listen to the society first before choosing the subjects to be dealt. Then the number of contributions for the agenda in this public hearing had increased a lot to almost 700 contributions. And also what surprised is it was the number of the proposals that was accepted by the agents to the agenda. It was almost 70% of the proposals for the agenda to 21-22 was accepted by ANEL. They are very representative figures, and it means a lot. It really means an increasement of public participation and decision making at ANEL, which is a really effort that you have done along the time. And then after the regulatory agenda, usually the regulatory cycle includes the regulatory impact assessments and the regulation by itself. And the regulatory impact assessment is really the main subside to decision-making on regulation ANEL. Usually it's open to public hearing also in 2 stages. Firstly, it's presented to the public regulatory impact assessment report. And then in the second stage, it's presented the draft regulation. And then at the final, the final regulation is approved by the board of directors. The formulation of the impact assessment report is established by an internal normative resolution, and then it gives some minimum requirements for the report. For example, it has to include summary, executive summary, identification of the regulatory problem, the identification of affected stakeholders, justification for the agent's intervention, to present some alternatives and describe the alternatives to solve the problem and their impacts, comparing the alternatives, usually preferentially some quantitative methods, and identification, monitoring, inspection strategies. This report is in fact a result of intensive research done by the technical areas of ANEL. This is really, most of them is really developed inside ANEL. And then this staff involves themselves in activities such as evaluating the problems and objectives, collecting information, using public participation mainly, but also other sources, choose the appropriate methodology to analyze and compare the alternatives, collect and manage data, and bring it to different public stakeholders, their results and evidence. Then you have some challenges in this middle of this process of impact assessment. The first related to method to analyze the alternatives. The methodologies at the ANEL follow the guidelines and guidance of good practice developed for the Brazilian Civil Office Cabinet. It gives us a general instructions and support on the develop the report and the methodologies to be chosen. But the preferred methodologies until now at ANEL, among the listed by the civil office, I could highlight is the multi-criteria analysis. It's a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods, and usually it seeks a compromise, a solution, negotiating view of the various objectives it must meet. And it fits very well with the mission of the ANEL, that it's in the middle of different stakeholders, and they have really to balance the market. It's one of the reasons that this methodology have been used. Also, it's possible to consider in this methodology some public values such as social justice, affordability, fees, all associated with inequalities. That's a very important concern in countries as Brazil. You use also some quantitative methods of CBA, benefit analysis, but it's in small scale because, in part, because the necessity to identify clearly costs and benefits, express them in monetary values, and then reliable data is necessary, and that is a weak side of the impact assessment and the NL. And the other important side of methodological assessments is the collection of data and the way that you convert this into evidence. NL has a very heterogeneous environment and very diversity data source and diverse necessities that you have a mix of solutions. The technical areas in general have developed some local solutions, mostly based in ordinary tools like VBA, SAS, R, Python, among the others, and to attend the most immediate or relevant needs and requirements. Then, for example, you have the regulation of distribution has its own database on distributed generation. The tariff manager superintendents have developed a system to receive and give data to other public institutions on markets and consumers, more aggregated data. The geoprocessing solutions are available to authorization or approval public concessions. And the first time, in fact, these data usually are used much more in a local in local areas, and then we are preparing for collecting data along the regulatory cycle for the first time using through the transmission regulation superintendency that it's already included and all the regulatory cycle, monitoring the following activities for data management. In most cases, NL uses secondary data. That is, the quality of data is really very important. Then, agency now is working integrated database. This internal with external organizations, and also to develop a corporate data governance. This is really a novelty. You take about 2-3 years already to be tangible, but we think that will improve a lot the quality of our data because it improves. You have curators of data, could approve, to analyze, to receive feedbacks, and really have a better data quality. And finally, you have to have also communication, the external audience. In this regulatory cycle, as I said, the public hearings are the main channel for communicating, and then but you use also social networks that's done some short videos on the issues to be regulated and present along the regulatory cycle before the public hearings, webinars, also some events, participation, the scientific events, and even publishing in scientific news magazines or relevant channels for communicating. And also the public meeting of the board of directors, because it's accessible through the internet and it's online. And then I could say, for finishing, that you have already some challenges to do at NL. The first relates to the impact assessment, is closing the whole regulatory cycle, and then to improve the assessment regulatory performance. You have already worked on this. Soon you have an internal guide. You have already a working group working on this. It's developing a guideline based on experience of other countries, but also some pilot projects chosen by NL. And you are working also to improve the training capacitation on methodologies and assessments, and also to improve not only to the technical staff that works on the the regulatory assessments, but also to the whole agency to really develop institutional capacity building in appraisal and evaluation. Working on the data quality and data governance, and this way, this data governance policy that I now have introduced, you think you give a big leap. And then finishing also maybe a spoil for the next conference. You are working on capacity building, regulatory compliance, costs and risks. It is already some issues that you have to deal. That's okay, that's all.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you very much. You stressed the fact that the capacity of regulators to perform their missions and to analyze the effects of their actions is really dependent upon the data they get, their capacity to collect data, and also to their capacity to consult all stakeholders, including consumers. So regulators should not be afraid to get out of their ivory tower and be challenged by not only stakeholders they regulate, but in general public opinion. So we just had two presentations by two energy regulators. I'd like now to give the floor to Laurent Clerc, who is the Director for Research and Risk Analysis at the Autorité de contrôle prudentiel et de résolution, which is a bank and French bank regulator, for 10 minutes on the impact assessment in the context of bank regulation. Laurent, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me in this panel. So in effect, I will talk about banking regulation, which is slightly different from what we've heard so far, but I hopefully will touch upon some issues which are a bit general. So what I'm going to talk about is banking regulation in the context of the work done by the Basel Committee. So this is an international body, but what I'm going to say also applies at the European level, since these international guidelines need to be enforced in Europe through European directive or regulation, which means that at each level, you may have an additional impact assessment study to measure and calibrate the impact of measures. So in terms of financial regulation, what are the main issues at stake? Well, the first is that regulators need to strike the right balance between financial stability and growth, to the extent that regulation is detrimental to growth. So this can be framed as the risk-return trade-off in a way. So there are, in this context, two main challenges. The first is that market and financial players are usually short-sighted and focusing on very short-term developments. And the other is that financial cycles are asymmetric. So on the upside, there are potential gains, which can generate an alignment of interest of all financial players. And in financial booms are generally accompanied by a deregulation process, whereas in the downside, the conflict of repartition arise in general due to moral hazard. So usually people say that profit are privatized, whereas losses are mutualized. And therefore, this generates a strong demand for regulation. And we sometimes speak about financial repression to the extent that it goes too far. So what are the challenges in this context? In the context of financial regulation, you really need to set the appropriate incentive and avoid unintended consequences. So financial regulation is firstly about setting the appropriate incentive. So what regulation can do, bad incentive can undo. And the second fact is that financial sector is like an organism. So it is continuously adapting to its regulatory and economic environment. And in this context, financial innovation may be used to circumvent the new rules. So how derive the benefits and the cost of policies? So in general, in the context of financial regulation, it follows a two-step process. The first test is about assessing the consistency and the calibration of requirements. So consistency means that you need to make sure that the measure is not upsetting the benefits of another measure of another regulation. And the other dimension is the calibration of measures. So typically in the banking regulation, you need to fix some regulatory requirements which are based on capital, say, or the level of leverage that an institution can take on board, or the amount of liquidity it must keep on its balance sheet. And so the calibration of this measure is usually based on intensive quantitative impact studies, which are conducted with the industry. So this raises a lot of challenges, in particular, the fact that if you think in terms of international regulation, you need to set measures that will apply in the context of different countries which have their own financial structures. And then it has also to apply to a set of institutions which may have different business models. So that's one part of the challenge. And then the second step is to measure the impact of incentive. I already touched upon this issue, but also on behaviors, because consumers, investors, firms will adapt to that. And finally, the impact on financial markets and the macroeconomy. And this step is much more challenging as it requires substantial economic and financial analysis. In the former panel, we talked about counterfactual analysis, and here it's particularly challenging in this context because financial regulation or measures may interact with other policy measures, typically fiscal or monetary policy measures in the aftermath of financial crisis. Finally, how regulatory scoreboards are built and what are the challenges? So in the context of financial regulation, the scoreboards are based on the impact measures on the new rules on firms' balance sheets, typically. So here there is a challenge because in order to measure the impact of the measure, you need to carry out quantitative impact studies with the industry. And here this approach introduces a strong bias. The first is that for the industry, in this context, there is an incentive to exaggerate the negative impact of the regulation and to minimize the benefits. And as a consequence, for the regulator, you may start with the most stringent parameterization. So it means that in order to get a satisfactory, and this needs to be defined, assessment measure, you need to go through several rounds of quantitative assessment with very poor quality data in the first round of the assessment. And it means generally a very costly evaluation process. So these assessments are usually carried out ex ante through quantitative assessment method and ex post. So for instance, the Basel Committee just set out to evaluate the impact of the measures taken in the banking industry. Now here there is also a challenge, and that was touched upon in the previous talk, which is the need to factor in the systemic dimension, I would say. So it is particularly relevant in the context of financial markets, because financial players or financial markets do not work in isolation. And finally, perhaps in terms of process, what we have put in place after the great financial crisis, in order perhaps to enhance this regulatory process, are two important things. The first is peer review assessment. So when you take and implement a rule, another jurisdiction is going to review your implementation and the way it has been factored in. So that is really something which has improved the process. And the second is also to introduce a review clause, because by this review clause, you can go again and revise the regulation if needed, ex post, based on what you have evidence with the implementation of the measures. So I have finished my intervention. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Many issues on the table, maybe also linked to the fact that it's a special kind of regulation in the sense that it may be different from infrastructure regulation, as some of us are familiar with. What I retain is the way you regulate in the context of instability or a constantly evolving environment, and how you what impact assessment means in such a context. So how you take into account the constant evolution. But I don't want to take the floor too much. I also retain your idea of a peer review assessed market, and this gives me a very good transition with the next speaker, who is Alex Durand. She is from the OECD at the Regulatory Policy Division, an analyst, which is in the Directorate for Public Governance. And I think she may talk a little about one of the exercise conducted by OECD, which is the PAFR review, performance assessment for economic regulators. And this is precisely an example of the tool, which is peer review assessment. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. It's traditional for this seminar to coincide with our biannual meeting of the OECD Network of Economic Regulators. So I have to thank the Dauphine Club de Régulateurs for their valued cooperation on this over the years. Both of these meetings have looked a little different this year, but we're very happy to have contributed to the organization of this seminar, which thanks to the insights from all of the contributors has been very rich so far. So I'm here today, indeed, to share 3 lessons that we have learned about regulators' performance assessment over the course of numerous in-depth reviews of regulators. So these 3 takeaways are, on the one hand, the need for linking strategy and performance indicators. 2, the need for balance between input, process, output, and outcome indicators. And 3, the importance of this final step of using the indicators and using the performance information. I'll base my comments today on these in-depth reviews that Anne mentioned, but the reviews themselves are underpinned by the OECD's normative work, which relates to the performance of regulators. In particular, I'll just highlight that our OECD best practice principles on the governance of regulators have some really excellent guidance on performance evaluation as a key contributor to good governance. These best practice principles outline the key considerations in measuring and evaluating the performance of regulators across all of the steps of the evaluation, everything from identifying the scope to defining the indicators to finally using this performance evaluation. So drawing upon OECD's normative work, we conduct what we call Performance Assessment Framework for Economic Regulators, or PAFR reviews. We conduct these reviews at the request of the regulator. And through the course of the review, we assess their internal and external governance and make a series of recommendations all throughout a peer review process. We've applied this PAFR methodology to a very diverse set of regulators from different sectors, different national and cultural contexts. So we really do have a rich set of information to draw upon here. And in each of these reviews, we capture how the regulator understands, measures, and of course reports upon its performance. So this is my first takeaway that I'll be discussing, which is the importance of linkages between strategy on the one hand and performance indicators on the other. So when we're talking about strategy and performance assessment, the key words are really connection or coherency. Some regulators we've seen do have a clear linkage between strategic objectives and specific indicators. This linkage really allows the regulator to measure progress in a way that creates the connection and the coherency, as well as this connection between different time scales, short, medium, and long term. As an example, the Peruvian transport regulator, OSITRAN, we reviewed, connects its high-level strategic objectives to its specific performance indicators using what it calls strategic actions. OSITRAN also ranks its indicators by priority, which is key to understand when and where the regulator should allocate its resources. So we've seen that some regulators certainly do have this connection in place, but many don't. Other regulators monitor indicators that aren't feeding into the strategic framework, which is really a big missed opportunity. So we've seen that there's scope to strengthen this area, and certainly regulators could exchange experiences and learn from each other here. This brings me to my second takeaway, which is the need for balance between indicators of different categories. When we review a regulator, we put their performance indicators in 4 different boxes: input, process, output, and outcome. The input category of performance indicators is measuring the efficiency and the effectiveness of input. So it would capture organizational and financial performance. For example, measuring whether planned activities were completed on time and within budget. The process indicators capture the quality of processes for regulatory activity. They measure the existence and effectiveness of the use of regulatory tools and processes. For example, showing if they're accurate, timely, accessible, participative. Output indicators show the effectiveness of the regulator's actions. So here we're looking for indicators, for example, that measure the reach of activities like consumer protection campaigns, or other indicators might measure how regulatory decisions hold up to external review. Finally, we have outcome indicators that measure the direct outcome or impacts, like compliance with regulators' decisions, but also capture these wider outcomes, Those might relate to market structure, service and infrastructure quality, consumer welfare, potentially industry performance. These wider outcomes are meant to be what we call watchtower indicators to help a regulator identify issue areas, problems, priorities, and to orient decision-making. So ideally, a regulator would have indicators on the strategic level speaking to all 4 of these categories: input, process, output, and outcome, to give a really comprehensive view of the regulator's performance. However, we've observed that the indicators of regulators are often show some imbalance between these different categories. A common pitfall is relying more on output indicators, such as recording the numbers of inspections, instead of attempting to understand the quality of processes or understanding the impacts on the sector. Our data also shows us that some types of performance information are neglected. Our OECD indicators on the governance of sector regulators show that over a sample of 157 regulators across network sectors, 20% or more are not collecting information habitually about the quality of the regulatory processes, and also indicators falling into this input category, like the organizational governance of the regulator. Younger agencies, of course, might rely more on input and process indicators simply as a matter of necessity, or to encourage the development of strong institutional procedures and foundations. As an example, I'll give the Mexican Agency for Safety, Energy and Environment, ASEA, which was showing an initial emphasis on input and process indicators when it was a young agency. But during our review of ASEA in 2017, ASEA leadership had voiced a commitment to revisiting its indicators to balance the different categories of performance information. This brings me to takeaway number 3. Certainly the use of performance information is a key step to drive better outcomes, but it's not without its challenges. So my first 2 takeaways related more to the development of appropriate indicators, but of course also what is key is how this information collected is ultimately used. Performance assessment, of course, is useful internally, where, for example, the regulator might be using it to reorient its priorities and its resources, but it's also very useful externally, where the regulator uses this information to send messages on the work of the regulator and really prove the regulator's value. Of course, using this performance information certainly presents its own challenges. First, the monitoring and the assessment themselves can be incredibly resource intensive. So regulators have to ensure that the ultimate use for this information is balanced with the effort required for the performance assessment. After all, what is the point in devising elaborate indicators and asking staff to fill out tables and crunch numbers if this information isn't truly driving better performance? Second, we have this challenge of translating the highly technical work of the regulator into indicators that can be used by the agency and appreciated by stakeholders. This challenge is further complicated by the issue of, for example, attribution for some indicators, where some stakeholders might want to attribute wider sectoral outcomes directly to regulator behavior. So these 2 challenges, and certainly more that I didn't have time to include, highlight the importance of a very deliberate approach to the use of performance information. I'd say what we've learned from these reviews is regulators that begin with the end in mind are those whose performance evaluation is the most successful. I believe that brings me to the end of my time, so I'll just say thank you again to Delphine and the other speakers. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Alex. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it's the last speech we have, because unfortunately one of the speakers, Nadia Osman from the Bundesnetzagentur, had a much bigger connection problem than I had, so she could not attend, and she apologized. There are questions from the floor, from the virtual floor, that I'd like to ask to all of you. One question relates to, well, someone would like to have some examples of indicators in times of transformative changes. So would you have in mind such example of precise indicators when there are changes, like we are experiencing some changing due to the sanitary crisis? And the second one is pretty much linked to what Alex has just said on the different type of indicators and the different degrees of difficulty you may have. There are some kind of indicators, the one on inputs and outputs, that are the one easy to get and to collect. Well, much more input than output, and there are others which are more qualitative, like the quality of the process, which are more difficult because it's difficult, it's qualitative. And another reason why some difficult when it comes to outcome indicators is it's because it's very difficult to disentangle the effects of the regulatory actions from the effect of other types of action, political measures or a broader context. So the question is, which it's a tough one. Which impacts are the most difficult to measure? Do you have precise example of them? So I leave you with these two questions. If you could give us, because we just have, I think, 7 minutes left. Maybe Carmen.
Yes, yes. Well, it's a trick question on the indicators. As I said, closing the regulatory cycle is already a novelty at ANEEL, and then you work a lot on assessing the regulatory performance, and then the indicators have been very important. But important side of this process has been also monitoring. Then you have worked on to develop a better indicator for monitoring, and then also already the process and outputs to follow these changes. For example, and you have also, for example, working and regulatory problems related to innovation, and that they just have this challenge to find out some indicators in the environment full of uncertainties and disruption and technology changes, and this you didn't find out already the correct indicators, but we are following the process as this is Alex said, and developing indicators for the whole stages of this cycle, and then. But I think that the monitoring inside the agency, monitoring has been really a tricky activity that you have involved much more in order to have really a good outputs or outcomes. That's it.
Thank you, Carmen. Laurent, would you have some examples?
Yes, well, the current situation is quite particular compared to the former financial crisis, because in the first financial crisis, banks were the problem. Now they are part of the solution. So it means that the regulatory response needs to be very different. So in this context, what is really implemented in the context of the financial sector are counterfactual measures, which may facilitate the financing of the economy. And therefore, the approach is radically different. And with respect to other measures, the argument is really rather to either relax part of the existing regulation or to postpone the implementation of what was designed to address the roots of the former financial crisis. So here we are in a very different situation where you still need a lot of indicators to assess the impact, but the regulatory response is not that evident in that context, besides countercyclical measures. Sorry.
Thank you very much. And last word to Alexi, who I'm sure have a lot of examples of precise indicators and the one which are the most difficult to measure. You already said words on that, but maybe you could elaborate a bit.
Well, actually, Anne, I was thinking of leaving that second question more to our colleagues from the regulators, but I will take a stab at the first one. And what I wanted to say was that during times of transformational change, the stakeholder might have the most valuable information earliest that can then feed back into an assessment. So I've certainly heard that institutional ways to capture these stakeholder views are very varied. And for example, we heard in Warwick's presentation about these standing consumer councils. But I wanted to give the example of the Latvian Public Utilities Commission, who back in the time of our review in 2016 was conducting surveys with stakeholders and with customers that fed directly back into its performance assessment. That's all.
Thank you very much. I think we are perfectly on time. So I'd like to conclude this session by, first of all, thank all the participants and speakers It's a very difficult question, and there are lots of things to share. So one session is not enough, but you contributed a lot to improve our knowledge and reflection on this issue. I also would like to thank Eric Brousseau and the Club des Régulateurs and the Chair, as well as the Network of Economic Regulators who co-organized this session. There are a lot of stuff to do again, lots of job to do to complete the impact assessment of regulatory action. So that means that we still have a lot of things to do. That's a good news, I would say, as a conclusion. Thank you very much. Maybe Eric, or you would like to say a word to conclude?
Yes, well, I will give immediately the floor to Anna Pietikainen, who wants to make some concluding comments. Again, I'd like to thank all the panelists this morning and to the two chairs for having managed right on time the debate. And Anna, if you are online, the floor is yours for some concluding comments. Anna.
Hi, Eric. Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you to the delegates and all the participants for their presence. Thank you also very much for, excuse me, I'm having a bit of trouble here. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah. Thank you very much also to those of you who were with us at the OECD, or not physically at the OECD, of course, but at in the OECD committee meetings last week. We had a roundtable on regulation and emerging technologies on Monday, and then the 15th session of the NER on Tuesday. As everyone, I think we're all so much looking forward to be able to have these meetings in person, to be able to see each other and have chats over coffee, as well as be able to have longer meetings where we can have more interaction. But in that sense, I'm very grateful to Eric and Marie-Hélène from for this collaboration to allow this third day, in a way, of meetings of the NER to continue the discussions. So I think the talks have been very diverse. I think we've covered a lot of ground, many different topics, and I wanted to reflect a little bit on maybe one of the reasons for the diversity of the discussion. And it is about, why do regulators carry out performance assessment? And I think there are so many reasons, and there are also so many different audiences for this performance assessment. I think that speaks to a little bit to the diversity of the interventions that we've heard. So I think by law, traditionally, obviously, most economic regulators have the mandate of reporting on sector performance, or they at least have the mandate of ensuring the efficiency of markets. So therefore, you are endowed with powers to collect this data. So I think that's one of the first objectives that comes to mind when we think of monitoring and performance assessment by regulators. We also heard from Manuel about the use of what at the OECD we good regulatory management tools, so ex post and ex ante assessments. At the OECD, it's true that we don't have an overall view of how much these tools are used by regulators. We do have a survey, which is called the IREG survey, that looks at how these tools are used in OECD countries, but more from a center of government and public administration-wide perspective, rather than looking at independent regulators. So Manuel, if you're still online, I don't know if you are, we've just completed a review of the Portuguese energy regulator. So you'll be happy to know that obviously among our recommendations, we strongly encourage them to continue their use of ex ante impact assessment, and also to coordinate with your office in doing that, to coordinate methodologies across the Portuguese public administration. So those are the two kind of regulatory objectives of performance assessment that I think come to our mind when we think of regulation and regulatory delivery. But of course, when we think of the strategic framework as it is defined by regulatory authorities and the indicators that are defined to report on the strategic framework, and then the work programs, that that come out of the strategic framework. Obviously, performance assessment is a strong internal tool for the management of regulatory authorities to see how they are advancing on their annual work programs. But beyond that, I think the strategic framework, and this is something that we look at very much in the PAFA reviews that Alex was mentioning, beyond that, I think the strategic framework, as well as the performance assessment activities that accompany it, are a very powerful internal tool for regulators to build their identity and to build their culture and to build a common sense of purpose for their staff. So of course, this means that the process through which the strategic framework is built needs to include also the staff of the agency for them to all have a common direction, if you will, in carrying out their everyday tasks. But of course, this is not only an internal tool. It's obviously very, very important for what we might call external relations, but that sounds almost too superficial in a way. So therefore, communicating to others the direction and the raison d'être of the regulatory authority. And this is why I'm very happy that several of the speakers also brought up the involvement of stakeholders, either in the definition of the indicators or in the monitoring itself. Obviously, independent regulators are independent for a very important reason, but it does not mean that these agencies are not accountable. It does not mean that these agencies should not be subject to scrutiny by external parties. So we heard from the National Audit Office in the UK, and obviously this would be the legislative branch, or in some countries also the executive branch, to whom the regulator is accountable to and has to present its annual reports to. But this is one area where we often discuss to what extent can regulators actually go beyond what is required in law. So there may be a requirement in law to prepare one annual report and to present it, or to email it, or to fax it or post it to the Parliament. But we often discuss what are the ways in which regulators can go beyond just this legal requirement. And I find it very encouraging to have heard these various examples today in how this is possible. So I think it's really important to bear some of these different objectives in mind when regulators are defining their strategic framework, their strategic objectives and their indicators, and how they want to bring all of these together. So to bear in mind these different objectives that this framework will be filling out. We heard also about many different areas of challenges, I think, that still remain. I think Anne also mentioned there's still a lot of conversations for us to have around these different challenges, from how do you define the right indicators, how do you not get stuck in the metrics, as Anne was saying, at the beginning of the workshop, how do you define the right targets, and you're not too vague in saying you want to reduce prices for consumers. But also there are many challenges we heard with respect to collecting data. So just the quality of data, or perhaps regulated entities complying with the requirement for them to send data. I think in many countries we have also heard of regulated entities that do not want to turn over the data, or they think that it is too burdensome for them to hand over the data. So this is also a responsibility for regulators in data collection to make sure that the level of burden on entities is as low as possible. We also heard about the challenge of turning data into evidence. This is linked to the quality of the data analysis, quality of or the adequate skills and resources in the regulatory authority. And obviously this is an increasing challenge in the current context where data is abundant, more and more abundant
So let me regret that we didn't get the end of her brilliant synthesis of what was said today, and let me add to the multiple difficulties she identified in developing assessment methodologies, not only the fact that the different regulators have different mandate, but many regulators have in fact actually a multiple mandate, which make them which make it even more difficult to measure their performance and also their impact, and also those mandates are evolving as time goes, as the preference of the various stakeholders are evolving, and the political debate is also evolving. So I will reiterate my thanks to the OECD teams, and in particular Anna Pietikainen and Alexis Durand for their help in organizing this meeting. I also want to thank Marie-Hélène Caïtucoli from the Chair Governance and Regulation for having set up the organization. I think we will move to another media next time to try to experience less difficulties, less technical problems. Thank you very much for attending this conference today, and again thanks to all the participants, to all the panelists for their very interesting contribution to our meeting. And more will come on the website of the event. Some additional documents provided by the panelists, and also in a few days from now you will get a written synthesis and maybe some videos drawn from the conference. So thank you so much, and we'll have another meeting, I hope in person in the fall in Paris, a joint meeting of the NER and of the Club des Régulateurs. Thank you very much, and for those who are around in Europe, have a nice lunch, nice dinner to those in Asia and Australia, and enjoy your breakfast in the Americas.